my question would be: you have this, you laid down this critique in your paper, which is the one you published, an alternative cognitivism, computational phenomenology for deep learning. And in that paper, you kind of critique the current, let's call it the cognitivist or the computational theory of mind kind of framework of understanding human cognition. So if you could lay down what that critique was, just for a general audience of cognitivism, but also then why do you propose computational phenomenology as an alternative framework for future AI research?
Yeah, so that's quite in the same line of what I was just saying. So the purpose in that paper is to begin from the understanding of phenomenology as an established field that is valuable to understand cognitive life in general, right? And when you depart from that perspective, you are departing from a very different perspective when you depart from the computational theory of mind. And there's a whole history of computational theory of mind where we find a very rich literature, where you have different approaches, beginning with the more let's say computationalist one that starts with Jerry Fodor, the modularity of the mind, and then all of the revisions that that approach has been receiving. And then you move on to parallel distributed processing, inspired kind of like theories of computational theory of mind, which is cognitivism or connectionism. And the thought in that paper was to kind of like raise up the question, which is not a question that is it's new. Other people like Tim van Helder, who is very well known for his work in dynamical systems, as rose the same kind of question, which is what is the requirement of borrowing certain concepts from the toolkit of these other more computationalist views, such as the view that is developed within modularity of the mind, such as notions like representation, for example. What purpose, Tim van Helder asked, and we also ask in this paper, what purpose does really the notion of representation is going to serve, if any, in that framework to understand the mind? So we follow that and get inspiration on that a little bit. We are on board with that question. We really do not see a reason to keep that cognitivist view, to think about these network systems that would require an explanation that includes the notion of representation. So that's kind of like where we are in the paper. And then as we think about and we are inspired by these questions, right, then we need to think about the ways in which we develop machine learning systems, right? So the question then became, if we are training machine learning systems to do tasks such as perception, then perhaps a better way of thinking about perception would be rather than taking perception as the old school computationalist view takes it, as a recognition of inputs and outputs, very computational in character, then perhaps we should take perception as the phenomenon of perception, right? And by phenomenon of perception here, I mean going to the phenomenology of perception and taking perception as a phenomenon that is characterized with all of those phenomenal aspects to it, rather than a computational process of a recognition of inputs and outputs with some form of computational information processing. Right. So once we did that exercise and we were like, okay, if we want the machine learning to behave like us, after all, that was the whole initial goal of artificial intelligence, was precisely, can we build systems that are similar to some kind to us? Then if we really are after building those systems that can perceive, recognize things in the world in ways that we do, then perhaps we should take one of the most established approaches and theories to understand precisely how we perceive the world, if that makes sense.
Totally. Well, this probably, is a good segue to a deeply philosophical question. Uh, from let's call it scientific realism. So, would a computational phenomenologist framework be a non-scientific realist framework? Would it view the world in terms of scientific realism? Oh, perhaps for the listeners, you could define what scientific realism is, and then try to how would a through this framework, through the computational phenomenology framework, how would you view scientific realism? Are you for it or are you against it? If I could put it in a crude way. Like that.
Yeah, so scientific realism is it's got an incredibly rich literature in philosophy of science. I find it extremely important for anyone that is a scientist to get educated on that and really take a stance and think about what their understanding of scientific practice is. Because however you answer or whatever you are going to situate yourself on that debate is going to be quite informing of the kind of like science that you practice. So scientific realism, to put it in a nutshell, which is probably not fair to the debate because it's extremely vast and rich. Yes, but to put it in a nutshell, you have on the one hand you have scientific realism. Let's put it like in one side of like the range, and then you have on the other side, let's call it instrumentalism. Then you have many different. You got many different approaches that are quite established and appealing and robust. So, but to talk about these two edges, you've got scientific realism, and it departs from somewhat Plato's philosophy, which is this view that there are certain ideals in the world, and the job of a scientist is to go out to the world and find those ideals. So science is a process of discovery of what is out there in the world, such that then what we would have is what our scientific practice is going to be. An output of it is going to be some kind of like model that somehow is going to be isomorphic to the thing in the world that has been discovered. So there's some form of isomorphism, and here there's a vast number of approaches that have been developed that really need to be really carefully understood, and I probably will not venture there right here because that would be another episode. So then you have on the other side, on the very other side, you have instrumentalism. And instrumentalism is slightly more of a constructivist approach. And in this constructivist approach, in its more radical form, of course, this is a range, more radical form, what you have is the view that there aren't really ideals, like Plato would have it, there aren't really ideals in the world. What there is these real world objects that exist, and then the scientific practice itself is going to be to begin with first looking at the world, and by looking at the natural world, we would see, because we are reasoning beings, we have the capacity to identify patterns in the behavior, how the natural world behaves and changes, etc. We are able to identify patterns. And the job of science is to make those patterns intelligible, such that if I would not engage and develop scientific experiments and critical thinking, we would not gain epistemic reach on those patterns. They would still exist, the objects and the behavior is still there. Those are real things that exist in the world. It's just that engaging in the scientific practice is kind of like allowing us to bring up this kind of like intelligibility, because we see those patterns, this intelligibility that we would not have if we were not engaging in scientific practice. So these are the two options. But then there's, of course, a whole range of very rich literature.
Indeed. So, but then from the two options, how would a computational phenomenologist, which side would they, let's say, side with or sway more towards?
Right. So then that would depend on what kind of like philosophy of mind you would bring in. Right. So the philosophy of science, scientific realism is not going to answer that question in itself, because then you have to also bring in a kind of like a philosophy of mind framework, right? So let's say that we were going to put aside the computational theory of mind.
Okay.
Right, so let's say that we put aside the computational theory of mind and we want to understand and develop artificial intelligent systems with computational phenomenology, right? So that's what we want to do. So that is, in my perspective, a very compelling project to pursue for several reasons stated before. One of the reasons is that if you do want to attain the early goal of artificial intelligence, which is that these systems are as close as possible to us, then computational phenomenology is the best bet. I'm not saying that it's going to be possible, but I'm saying that this is the one that I find that it's most appealing to get to that. Why? Well, because one very important aspect of our cognition and what is part of our defining us as human, natural, intelligent systems is that we have that the ways in which we interact with the world for a certain purpose that is can be described within the phenomenology of the ways in which we do things that are meaningful to us and how things in the environment become meaningful to us given our experience. So phenomenology is going to be very relevant to precisely get us anywhere close, if we even have a shot, to get like some artificial intelligence to be closer to our natural intelligence. So in that sense, the model, so now that I've defined the philosophy of mind framework that I'm bringing in, now I'm going to move on to the philosophy of science framework that I think it's going to be the correct way of looking at the computational models that we develop. I think that the computational models that we are going to develop, they are what they are. They are computational models, right? So what they are is they are these useful tools that are incredibly sophisticated, and they do not come out of nowhere. They are they emerge from incredibly sophisticated intelligence and resources that we have as a technoscientific community been developing as part of the incredible capacity that human civilization has. So then these are tools that we develop. What I mean by this is that these computational models are things that exist in the world in a way that it's not independent from our own doings, our own practices that are incredibly highly situated in social cultural communities of epistemic communities, right? So these are our own doings. And I think that this is relevant because it's moving us away from scientific realism in the sense that I'm thinking about these computational models, for example, those that use machine learning, is tools that we develop, right? So in that sense, what we have is we have these computational models or even artificial intelligence systems that are a product of our technoscientific development. And those are tools. They're not much more than that. And then what we can do with them is we can ask them to do things for us. For example, we can develop a system that whose job is to recognize patterns, right? And these patterns can be like a task of image recognition, identifying, categorizing, all of those kinds of things that we can ask a machine learning system to do. But it can also be the case of these large language models, for example. What do? They do exactly that, the recognition of patterns. So exactly. So then what happens is that what you have is an explanation here that you hold. On the one hand, you are holding a quite clear philosophy of mind theory and framework, which is like, why am I holding this one and living and setting aside the other ones? Well, because I think that this one is the one that best describes our human way of perceiving the world, our human cognition, our psychological life, and the ways in which we are conscious beings navigating a complex world. That's why I'm holding this philosophy of mind framework and setting aside the computational theory of mind. So that's justified for me. And then I'm bringing in a philosophy of science framework that I think has got sufficient reasons that is going to be useful, because what I'm saying is that in our own doings, as we are epistemic communities and engaging in technoscientific practices, developing all of these AI systems, right? We develop these tools that are part of our practices. And those tools are going to allow us to do certain things in the world, right? But those are not more than tools. These are tools that are completely emerging from our socioculturally situated practices as techno-scientists.
Perfect, perfect. In fact, Inês, this perhaps lays the groundwork for a bit more of the technical questions, because one thing you beautifully outlined in the paper was, firstly, you described what this representationalist framework, which I believe is inspired by cognitivism, is currently, it's through that framework a lot of contemporary AI researchers like work on their models, they build their tools. But then, of course, in the paper, what you propose is a non-representationalist framework. So, and that was for me a key takeaway from the paper. Could you firstly perhaps outline what the current contemporary representationalist framework is and how it's being used by AI researchers, and then what you propose in the paper, which is the non-representationalist framework, and hopefully for a layperson to understand how these two differ and give us different grounds to work off.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking me that. Yes. So basically, now that we have laid out like the kind of like theoretical frameworks that we're working with, that allows us to go a little bit like more zooming in and focusing on the representation bit and why I do not think that we need it. Right. So the point is, I don't think that we need it. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it causes more confusion beyond the fact that it's wrong. So why is it wrong? If one would look into defining what a representation is, I would agree with many scholars that defend that a representation requires many other things, but I'm just going to focus on one for the sake of time and making the point here. A representation requires a fully embodied, symbolically enculturated being to be able to make a representation, communicate it, and understanding it. Yeah. Right? So then the idea here is that a representation requires someone like us. So it requires that we not only have those capabilities, but that we've been enculturated and skilled into symbolic structures like numbers, languages, any kind of like symbolic thinking that allows us to understand that something represents something else. And that not only our understanding of that, of something as representing something to us, as being meaningful to us in a certain way, but also communicating requires some kind of like symbolic structures that we need to engage with, like the language that I'm speaking right now. If we would not share a common language, I would not be able to communicate all of these ideas to you. So that's a requirement. So some part of in our developmental lives, we have been enculturated with a symbolic code that allows us to have this conversation right here, right now. Right, so So when I think about representation, there is a set of criteria that needs to be there. And this has actually been very well outlined by and defined by Frankie Egan on the conditions for representation to be the case, right? But I'm going to focus on the one that is, it requires symbolic enculturation. And that means it requires that we understand semantics, we understand meanings of things, right? So that being the case, note how it requires that human beings are situated in a social cultural environment and throughout life. It's not something that you just like are born with, but throughout time you develop and become ever more and more and more skilled, almost like riding a bike, in the sense that the more you ride the bike, the better and more skilled you become in riding a bike. So the enculturation with symbolic structures can be said to be quite similar in that sense. So then imagine this. I'm saying that it is possible for us to communicate because we share and exchange these forms of representations of how we understand concepts and the world, and we can use them properly. Now, why would we need to think about that's why I wanted to make the point that I just think including the notion of representation in networks of nodes that are computational processes is just going to be unnecessary. It's just not necessary to have it there. Because there have been some arguments to say that, well, it's useful to have it there. I don't think it's useful to have it there, and I think it's wrong. So wrong, why? Because these systems have not been enculturated with engaging in the world and understanding semantics in the ways that we do, because these are computational systems, and I'm going to describe the kind of they are in a moment. But they're not that. They're not human beings like us that have gone through these really developmental enculturation that we have. So they do not understand semantics. Right, so because of that, it would be wrong to say that node A represents what node B is saying. That would be wrong. Some people have argued that it is useful, nevertheless. Right, I think it's not useful because we are anthropomorphizing a network. Right, so that's not useful and that's wrong. Right, so I'm going to now give an example of what I mean in large language models. So that everybody's now
perfect example.
Exactly, because everybody now is acquainted with large language models like ChatGPT, and I want to talk about that. And this is perfect to give that the example of what I mean and the dangers of anthropomorphizing. Because it may be the case that until we had this new technology that is large language models, that we were just playing around with philosophy of mind and doing all of these things like anthropomorphizing these networks, these computational networks, and we would think like, oh, there's no danger in that. That's useful. And I'm going to tell you why it is dangerous and how that becomes very clear in the light of large language models that we didn't have before, right? So large language model, the way that I see it, is a perfect illustration of John Searle's Chinese room, right? Why is that? Because it performs things. It looks like it's intelligent. It looks like it understands semantics. It gets the job done, right? In a way that looks like it's something intelligent and understands semantics, but it doesn't. Because what happens in large language models is that we have these incredibly sophisticated predictive models, right? And I'm working on a paper that hopefully is going to be out soon, where we talk about and we define and describe large language models as not being calculators for as being calculators for words. What does this mean? This means that there are real dangers when we interact with large language models, because one goes to interact with it thinking that when I'm interacting with a large language model, that it's going to give me something that is factual. And that's just not what is happening, right? So whatever it is that it is the output, the content that is an output of a large language model is not a fact. But we take it as it being a knowledge fact, right? But it's not. what's happening is that we have these highly sophisticated predictive models that are going to predict tokens. So they're going to predict in the past, so until 2021, depending on which version we have, until 2021, these tokens have been the ones that have come together with these other tokens within this blanket of events or topic that we are talking about, right? So what they're going to do is going to tell us really how likely certain concepts and words and thoughts have been put together, right? So that's what it's going to give us. And that is on the basis of a monolith of data that we have that is sitting in the past. So it's not dynamic whatsoever. It's not nonlinear. It's just sitting there. And what it's going to give us is, and I think that this is the most important point that we need to understand, is that if we are using ChatGPT or any other large language model to generate knowledge for us, it is not going to be able to give us anything that is interesting in the future, because what it's going to do is just giving us an organization of how things that are usually coming together with other things in 2021. Right. So it might even take us back in all progresses that we may have done as a scientific community and as a social cultural community when it comes down to social cultural values and progresses that we may have made as communities and societies. So it's incredibly danger in that sense. And now I'm going to go back to wrap it up with the point that I was making. Why is it dangerous that we think or say or articulate that in a nodes network, like a machine learning networks that we use, right? Why is it dangerous to say that node A represents what node B knows, or the information from node B, in a very simple way, of course? What does it mean? It means that we are anthropomorphizing and working under the assumption that node A understands semantics. And that is not the case, is exactly as it's not the case in large language models, because large language models do not understand semantics. They don't understand what is going on. That's why they cannot give you facts. It's because they do not have an understanding of semantics. They do understand syntax, but they don't understand semantics. So that is that is the danger that comes with us anthropomorphizing and thinking that they understand what they're doing, but they have absolutely no clue what they're doing. So large language models kind of come as the perfect example of why we should refrain from using the notion of representation in any machine learning context or in any computational model that we develop. There is no need, and it's not even that it's not needed, it's going to be problematic in the sense of the ways in which we now look at large language models and what they can do for us.
Indeed. So, and just to clarify, I'm assuming you're saying, or you're theorizing, that if what you propose, which is the non-representationalist framework, are you claiming that if we use such framework, an AI agent or AI model made from such a framework would understand semantics?
No.
Interesting. So in the sense that, are you saying right now we haven't got any proper framework to understand, to build an agent that can understand semantics?
Absolutely. We do not have.
Okay,
I'm
glad that you clarified that.
Exactly. Yeah. So now let's bring in the philosophy of mind framework that I'm working with, that I selected, right? So let's bring that one in. Yeah. What would be the requirement? That's why phenomenology is going to be really important, and cognitive science is going to be really important.
We're going to go there for sure.
Exactly. Yes. So now let's think about what would be the requirement for an artificial system, right, to be able to understand semantics.
I have no idea.
Right. So what would be from this framework?
Well, I can speculate. Perhaps being in the world.
Being in the world.
To use a Heideggerian term.
Absolutely, being in the world, right? So doing what? Doing the things that we've been doing, which is from birth, being situated in a social cultural environment, right? That has meanings, that has values embedded in it, being part of these cultural practices, being part and contributing to these cultural narratives, being enculturated with these symbolic structures. Because sometimes people turn to me and they say, well, if all it takes is that an artificial system is embodied and embedded in an environment for it to be considered intelligent, somehow closer to the ways in which human beings are intelligent, then we can think about, for example, and they asked me, do you think that this would be enough that we would have, for example, a humanoid robot that is equipped with any sort of large language model, right? Because now we have embodied and we have embeddedness, right? And I'm like, that's not it yet, right? So we need to go back to what phenomenology says, but we need to go back to what cognition says, that are the defining properties of cognition, right? So if you begin from the point of view that to use Heidegger's notion of being thrown in the world,
Thrownness,
right?
yes.
Thrownness, which is a very, very wonderful concept. You're thrown in the world, and then you don't have a choice. You have to immediately start acting upon the world and immediately being situated and embedded in a very strong embodiment sense, not in a weak sense, with that environment, and already participating and being part of a certain specific social cultural environment, right? So that's what we are talking about. That's the level, that's the scale that we are talking about, right? So if you bring this this kind of like a philosophy of mind approach, as I am bringing, so then those would be very specific foundational requirements for any artificial intelligence system to be anywhere close to being able to have some level of sentientness or intelligence like we have. Because you need all of that interaction with the environment, not only on the phenomenological level, but also on the representational level, right? You need that interaction with the environment such that you are enculturated with this symbolic structure, such that you understand the use of concepts in the ways in which you interact with the world. And here, use, I'm really taking that notion in terms of the Wittgensteinian sense of the use of linguistic practices as embedded in cultural practices.
So would this be like the language games
Absolutely.
that Wittgenstein talks about?
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
Yeah.